In this, our last session, we'll continue our discussion about relationships with a few concluding comments at the end. I'll begin with a brief discussion of 4 stages of how we might understand our personal and relational work. And then I'll talk about some very specific views and practices that I introduce to couples that I work with. I might mention that perhaps you've had some experience in our sessions of an alternation between theory and more practical work. And this is something that's a reflection of how I work in sessions too, in clinical work, that I have an interest in always inviting people to connect their very concrete, specific behavior with a larger theoretical view, and always grounding their theoretical understanding in their daily behavior. And on a more subtle level, I hope that by alternating back and forth between theory and practical work, that a client, or perhaps you listening, might be left with a certain sense of unresolvability, that there's nothing exactly to hang on to, as we've talked about. And for me, this sense of an open ground between opposites, between contradictory energies, is right at the heart of at least a Vajrayana Buddhist view, a sense that the middle path, the middle way, is not some sort of half of this and half of that that's integrated, but this middle way actually has to do with finding ourselves with no ground to stand on. We can't actually take refuge in or identify with any view. And one of the more powerful ways to invite this experience is to train ourselves to hold contradictory views. So, why talk about stages? When we have an inspiration to improve our life, to grow, to wake up, and anybody listening to these discussions, of course, probably has that intention, then it's very helpful to clarify just what that intention is, because our efforts to be most effective should probably be in alignment with our highest priorities, our intentions. And so the idea of a path is an expression of intention. And it's usually very helpful to talk about the stages of a path, which reflects the idea that there actually is a sequence to our work, a natural sequence, a sequence that's not really negotiable. And this idea of a sequence of stages is central to Western psychotherapy, to evolutionary theory itself, certainly to Buddhism, and I think to most spiritual paths. I find this idea of a sequence of work, with the work we do at one stage laying the foundation for the work we do at the next stage, to be very accurate and very valuable. And it seems to be very precisely the same in my experience of my Buddhist practice and my clinical work with relationships. There are, of course, a lot of different theories and ideas about path and stages. There are theories with 3 stages and 9 stages and 12 stages and 7 stages, and I'm just going to present a very simple 4-stage view of the path of working on ourself and ourself in relationship that I have found to be very consistent with my actual clinical work. It actually comes out of my clinical work with couples. These stages could be called the pre-personal, the personal, the interpersonal, and the non-personal. Each stage actually can be understood as representing our attitude toward our already existing basic nature of open awareness and freedom. Each stage actually is a description of our capacity and our willingness to be fully present, fully embodied, to integrate open awareness into our daily life. Or to say it in a different way, each stage is a description of how we defend against open mind, how we generate chronic states of self-absorption. From this point of view, each stage is not really about some past wound or historic conditioning, nor is it about some future ability that we want to have. It's really about our choice to not be fully present and open in each moment, and the varieties of ways in which we pretend that it is not a choice to do so. So from the Vajrayana Buddhist point of view, this work always feels paradoxical. From the view that we are already free, none of this work is actually necessary. But because we are very invested in the drama of life being a problem, it's very helpful for practical reasons to progress through these stages, gradually increasing our tolerance of freedom and open mind in our daily life and in our relationships. The pre-personal stage is the arena of codependent dynamics, what we were talking about in some length last session. It's characterized by a claim, a position that we are unable to change. Either we can't do it because there's too much fear, or we don't know how, or we can't change because our partner somehow is not being who we want them to be, is blocking our ability to change. The position is really like that of a child relating to intense experience as if incapable of handling it. There's, of course, still a strong dissociative split, a tendency to leave one's immediate embodied experiencing. And as we talked about with neurotic organization, the investment is actually in not solving our apparent problems, because this drama of being a problematic person or our relationship being problematic is serving a protective function, we think. When we were children, of course, this was very healthy, very necessary, very intelligent, to find whatever means we could to prevent ourselves from feeling overwhelmed, flooded by intense experience that we had no control over. But for adequately functional adults, we actually continue to maintain this organization when it is no longer necessary. Most of us can, in fact, train ourselves to have a conscious relationship with very intense experience. But we choose, actually, to not do so. To be clear, the choice isn't to have a sudden ability to stay fully present and embodied, but there's always a choice to practice this capacity, to increase our ability. And that's what we choose not to do. At this stage of relationship, we actually rely on our partners to support this sense of being stuck or unable to be present. There's an endless list of explanations about, well, I would show up more in my vulnerability if only my partner, basically, would be who I want them to be. But, of course, our partners are always going to be who they are. So we always find justification to keep some distance, keep our guard up, basically to not be fully open and present. And if it's a good fit, of course, our partner is using us in a similar way. And both people, in fact, are maintaining an unconscious agreement to provide each other with the justification, the proof, about why they just can't be more present, why they can't really open their heart or be more intimate. The basic attitude really is to experience our partner as someone who could give us what we feel we really need and want, but who will not do so. And so we manufacture an endless series of complaints and frustrations while they're doing the same thing. This atmosphere of conflict and hurt generates the experiential evidence over and over again about why we cannot be open. Who wants to be open in a war zone? It's just not smart. So this whole stage of the pre-personal guarantees chronic self-absorption, which takes our attention away from our always already present environment of open awareness and choice. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I've done a little enactment where I've invited the people present to relax their awareness and just let their sense of attention fill the whole room with some sense of presence. And then as I'm giving these instructions, I begin a conflict with a student who I've already arranged ahead of time to join me in this. And we'll start a conflict about something. They don't like the way I'm talking or whatever. And the more heated this apparent conflict becomes, the more everyone's attention contracts. I've done this a number of times, and I don't think I've yet had anyone whose attention has remained expansive. The sense of a problem, of conflict, is so fascinating and perhaps threatening that pretty much everybody, on a very basic biological level, I think, contracts their attention to the apparent threat. But there was actually no harm happening. But everyone contracts their attention. They avoid the open, expansive awareness that's already there. The next stage is the personal. Through our life experience, through personal work, just through gradual maturation, many of us have cultivated a sense of ourselves that's strong enough to stand alone, without the need to necessarily involve other people in our unresolved, difficult emotions. At this point, we're willing to at least practice not relating to others as if they're either the cause or the solution to our difficult experience. So to me, it's helpful to think of the practice of personal responsibility as actually the antidote to codependent dynamics. And this is really where the majority of my work with couples is done, is in challenging, first of all, the codependent dynamics, and then over and over and over using ongoing daily life experience to strengthen the attitude of personal responsibility. When we, or as we, practice being the location of and having the responsibility for our own well-being, actually it becomes safer for us to be close to another person. If we see them as the location of our well-being in either a positive or negative way, as we discussed last session, that person actually becomes inappropriately important to us. The more we can stay grounded in our own embodied experience, responsible for dealing with our difficult feelings, paradoxically, the safer it is to be intimate with another person, because our reality becomes more real to us than their reality. To say in another way, it's actually very difficult to be more intimate with one's partner than we are willing and able to be intimate with ourselves. As we take personal responsibility for our difficult experience, we find out for ourselves if it's workable. As long as we're blaming another person, subtly or not so subtly, we have nothing really to work with, because they're the ones who need to change. As soon as we're willing to, let's say, swallow that sort of bitter pill of no more complaints, then we actually take ownership of exactly what it is we have to work on. This is the stage at which we are willing to have a relationship with other because we're willing to have a relationship with self. That other is both our partners, other people, and it's also the other of our disowned, unconscious, difficult experiencing. And as we have more and more of a conscious relationship with our fears, we may find, it's my experience, that pretty much everything we experience is workable. It doesn't mean we'll do a perfect job. It's just workable. This increasing confidence dissolves our dissociative split. We don't need to continue defending against certain emotions and energies that we actually did have to defend against as children. As our awareness begins to become more relaxed and expansive, we actually dissolve our subtle but chronic anxiety and paranoia. We start to be less guarded, and as we relax our attention, we begin to have more and more moments of being aware of our already existing context or environment of freedom. The next stage could be called the interpersonal. Our confidence and our capacity to take care of ourselves is increased to the point where we actually can risk revealing our authentic experience even to somebody who's incredibly important to us, like our partners. Our self-absorption is decreased to the point where we actually become more interested in others and in the world than we are in our own identity dramas. We take such good care of ourselves that we become interested in what others need, because we don't really live with a sense of need at this point. As we are willing and able to be kind to other, that includes increased capacity to be kind to our own internal other, our own fears, our vulnerability. And as we are able to have a more embodied, kind, conscious relationship with our vulnerability, we just organically and spontaneously become more empathic to others' vulnerability. So even though we may never really even understand our partner, we increasingly have the sense that, well, we're all in the same boat. We all have difficult, vulnerable experience, and it's not a problem, actually. It's not easy, but it's not a problem. So as this sense of greater expansiveness continues, greater empathy, kindness continues, we have an increasing sense of immediacy, openness, open-heartedness, curiosity. Not knowing who we are or how to have an intimate relationship actually becomes pleasurable. It's a source of creativity, not a problem to be solved. The last stage could be called the non-personal. Our experience here somewhat consistently arises in the context of open awareness or freedom. Not knowing who we are has become much more interesting than maintaining a familiar personal identity. And not knowing who one's partner is much more interesting than our familiar stories about them. We show up each moment because that's already the only moment in which we are living. There is no other choice but to show up each moment, but we stop pretending not to be present. And we deal with our life, with our relationship, not knowing what will happen next, but confident that we'll work with that as well because we're working with the present moment without withholding ourselves. Increasingly, there's a sense that it's not really even a self relating to one's partner or to the world, but actually it's just life relating to life. You may have noticed from just this brief discussion that as we have progressed through these 4 stages, I have less and less to say about each stage. That reflects our actual experience, that the more we pretend not to be present, the more we refuse to acknowledge the truth of our experiencing, the more of a complicated state of mind we create for ourselves and in our relationships. And it's this complication that actually serves to fascinate us, to contract our attention away from our open environment. The more of a complicated sense of self, the more complicated relationship I can have, the more fascinating it is. Maybe not pleasurable, but fascinating. As we move through this progression of personal experience and work, there's less and less to say, because there actually is less and less of an experience of there being a problem. There's still all of life difficulties to work with, they don't go away, but not from a complicated state of mind anymore. It would perhaps be helpful just to remind us that these stages are just tools, they're just ways of thinking. They're not actually a description of reality, so I hope nobody takes them too seriously. And it might be helpful to point out that all of these stages tend to actually be present at the same time. But our sense of emotional and psychic center of gravity tends to progress from the pre-personal to the personal to the interpersonal to the non-personal. And that center of gravity is just a way of describing our home base, what we return to. So couples who are very invested in the drama of codependency, for example, or really living in that pre-personal fantasy, are, of course, having moments of openness all the time, moments of genuine curiosity and compassion for their partners. And those of us who have done a lot of personal work, perhaps, and whose emotional center of gravity has progressed, still, of course, have codependent dynamics to work with. But as we progress through these stages, in terms of our center of gravity, we experience our life and our relationships increasingly as inherently alive, interesting, and not a problem. Our awareness relaxes in proportion to our willingness to give up our fantasy that we are a problem, our partner's a problem, and so on. I'd like to talk now about the actual views and practices that I find myself using every day in my clinical work with couples. Most couples come to therapy with a sense of dilemma. They've gone through what is often called the honeymoon stage, where most of us have the actual experience that we've found a partner with whom we will be happy the rest of our life. There's no evidence of any deep problems. We enjoy each other. Even conflicts are handled very smoothly and quickly. A lot of times there's sexual passion, and we just want to spend as much time as possible with this person. But generally speaking, 6 months, 2 years down the road, it turns out that this stage of apparently only positive experience has been supported by, strangely enough, a lack of deep intimacy. We don't even know this person yet. So as long as our needs for separateness, as we discussed in the last session, are being met by not knowing the other person, not living together, not having kids, sharing a mortgage, and so forth, it's very easy to continue wanting to be closer and closer, more connected, because our needs for separateness are taken care of just by our life circumstances. But after some period of time, a couple almost inevitably will become more intimate, more connected, and any unresolved issues we have about relationship will begin to be triggered. Usually this is experienced as a type of deep disappointment, and often this is where many couples end the relationship. When I take a history of relationships, it's very common that people report ending a number of relationships around the 2 or 3 year mark. This is where a lot of us as couples hit this sense of deep disappointment. But if there's enough connection, enough interest, perhaps enough maturity, and a couple decides to continue their relationship, then there's often a sense of a dilemma, feeling torn in both directions, because there is genuine love, care, compassion. They really do feel connected. And at the same time, there's all this pain that's coming out of what could be called these codependent dynamics. And that's really where the majority of couples come into therapy, in my experience. We really care about each other, but this is so painful what we're doing. We feel like we're destroying our love, and we don't know what to do. I see codependent dynamics, as I hope I've been clear, as a type of aggression toward fundamental reality, the reality of our already existing open nature, our vulnerability. And so we can understand codependent dynamics as a very aggressive attitude toward our own vulnerability, toward what's true. Because of this, most responses to codependency have to have a strong, aggressive, hopefully healthy aggressive response. When a therapist tries to just be supportive and kind and empathic with a couple who is trying to deal with strong codependent energy, it often doesn't go anywhere after perhaps feeling supported for a couple of months. And I've worked with a number of couples who have reported experience in therapy where, well, the therapist was a nice person, but we really didn't get anywhere. And I think it's because a lot of times therapists want to be kind and don't understand that sometimes kindness involves healthy, aggressive energy. So in my clinical work, I usually end up challenging codependent dynamics pretty strongly. And I do this in a variety of ways. I often present a fair amount of education at first about the dynamics of codependency. I talk about especially the mutuality involved, because usually a couple comes into therapy with each blaming the other person for their pain and their disappointment. So as a transition to personal responsibility, a lot of times it's very helpful to point out the mutuality that's going on, the unconscious agreements that the couple is perpetuating that allows each to hire the other person to be the location of one's own difficult emotions. I also often reframe intimacy as inherently disturbing, provocative, rich, meaningful, but unresolvable, and challenge the fantasy of a life without disturbance. My thinking when I present these types of views to clients is not that they're suddenly going to change their behavior, but my hope is that a type of experiential dialogue is begun, where a person can watch their impulse to blame their partner, for example, but perhaps recall the discussion where, gosh, Bruce said maybe I'm actually hiring this person to be this way. And it starts to invite a little bit of doubt, a little bit of openness, to have a view that doesn't fit our familiar explanations. Another common discussion that I'll have with people is to suggest that most of us growing up through very healthy motivations will try to disconnect from exactly those feelings, experiences that are most disturbing and unsafe. But by then devoting large parts of our life in the effort to never feel those feelings, paradoxically we end up putting exactly those feelings at the very center of our psychic organization. So if a person wants to start to free themselves of their conditioned history, it's possible that they will have to have a more conscious embodied relationship with exactly the feelings that they've dedicated most of their life to avoiding. Again, at this stage of work, it's presenting a view that is incompatible with the idea that one's partner is going to be the cause of our pain or the location of getting our deepest needs met. In line with that, I usually challenge language and thinking which allows somebody to position themselves as a victim, because almost anybody involved with codependent dynamics actually is invested in the fantasy of being a victim, which again is a very aggressive attitude toward life. Even though our culture doesn't identify that position as one of aggression, it usually involves a blame of other people and a claim that other people should take care of oneself, but then usually the person in the victim role frustrates any attempts to actually be helped out of that role. So it's actually a very sadistic position from a certain point of view, and I often label it that way to make it increasingly unpleasant to continue referring to oneself as a victim. I usually will invite somebody to start using I language rather than we language, because when people are very involved with what we call codependency, there's a very strong temptation to always try to understand what's going on as we. It's an unconscious reflection of our effort to be one emotional unit rather than tolerate being emotionally separate people. I often present the idea that most couples get together out of a very deep resonance about their core vulnerabilities. Often two people will get together with similar abandonment histories, let's say. They both have the sense that they will be left. In fact, they already feel like an abandoned person, but they still unconsciously are pretending it's something that might happen in the future. But most couples, I find, get together out of this very deep unconscious resonance where they really get each other, but neither person really is interested or willing yet to be fully responsible for having a conscious relationship with this core vulnerability, which may never get resolved in this life. So what usually happens is that we find a partner who has an opposite or complementary style of working with this deep vulnerability. In the case of an abandonment drama, let's say, one person has the unexamined position. Well, nobody's going to be there for me, so I guess I have to do all the work. If I want a relationship, I have to be the one that connects. I have to keep trying. I have to pull emotional engagement out of the other person. Their partner, mysteriously, may have the attitude that, well, no one's there for me, so I guess I'd better be self-sufficient. It's sort of stupid to extend to other people because I know I'll be disappointed. So now you have a couple where one person has the strategy of being self-sufficient and the other has the strategy of always trying to make connections. And then the couple can argue endlessly about their stylistic differences. The self-sufficient person can feel the other's trying to smother them or be dependent on them inappropriately or control them or whatever. And the connecting person can feel abandoned, not cared for. Why are you always just going downstairs and watching the TV instead of spending time together? But actually, both people are unconsciously agreeing to maintain a sense of problem in the relationship. It's almost like, again, being in a war zone. Couples get very polarized. And as long as I feel that I'm in a war zone, of course it's not safe or smart for me to go into my vulnerability. So the couple's maintaining an unconscious agreement to help each other out with a justification to never go into their immediate embodied core issues. But that core vulnerability is actually what brought them together in the first place. It's what they share in common. It's where they will find mutual empathy. It's where they'll find actually the basis of genuine friendship. So a lot of my work with couples presenting codependent dynamics is to challenge their mutual agreements and present them as such. I usually suggest to a couple that this is actually a deal they have that they're both agreeing to, and look for the benefits of that, because there are a sort of survival, immediate gratification benefits to these types of arrangements. Another very basic type of work I do when presented with codependent dynamics is to address constructive conflict skills, because almost by definition, this couple is invested in maintaining a sense of unresolvable conflict. It contracts their attention away from immediacy, from vulnerability, from openness. But if a couple's willing, then I invite them to consider for some time to only use behavioral negotiations, problem-solving behavior, when dealing with conflict, and to remove all emotional language and, as much as possible, even emotional energy from their conflicts. This, of course, doesn't mean don't talk about your feelings, but best to talk about your feelings when things are friendly, and if you need to, when things are difficult, fine, just practice listening to each other without having a discussion. Because until somebody's willing to practice personal responsibility for one's own difficult emotions, a couple's almost inevitably going to end up with a quickly escalating conflict, which is hurtful and over time actually tends to kill love. So I often suggest that for a while, anytime there's a conflict, whoever is disturbed makes a proposal that might help them with their disturbance, asking their partner to change their behavior in some way, understanding that it's not one's partner's responsibility to be who we want them to be or to change their behavior even. We are asking for their help, actually. Our partners actually are not doing anything wrong, usually. They're just being themselves, and they'll probably continue to be themselves. They're never going to be who we want them to be, so we're asking for their help. And if they're kind enough to give that help, it's appropriate to thank them, of course. But if we want our partner's cooperation, it's just intelligent to not talk to them in a way that's going to trigger their defensiveness or their emotional reactivity. It's better to talk in a neutral or even friendly way. Hard to do when there's a conflict, but that's the practice. So a lot of times at this stage of working with a couple, I will invite them to redo a conflict that they're reporting from the point of view of be negotiating about behavior change. It also is very helpful at this stage of things to consider an agreement that when either person feels that a discussion is heading in a destructive direction potentially, that they have the right and even the responsibility to call for a break, which will not be processed or discussed, but immediately respected. And I found that usually it works best for the person asking for the break to say when they'll check back in so that it doesn't become used as an avoidant technique. Also, it's usually more constructive to negotiate about these requests when things are relatively neutral or friendly. Negotiating in the middle of a reactive episode usually is not very helpful. What I run into a lot is that many couples have an unexamined attitude that emotional intensity is synonymous with intimacy. And so the coolness of this approach sometimes is not very attractive. So it doesn't work with everybody. But generally speaking, at this stage of the pre-personal, what is usually required is a strong intervention, a lot of structure, and in my style, a lot of education that makes it more difficult, hopefully, to continue this drama of mutual blame. As one or both partners experiment with some of this work, hopefully, and actually usually in my work, I find that there's an increasing interest in and willingness to practice personal responsibility, which of course is then entering the personal realm, the personal stage. I continue at this point to use a lot of education, a lot of reframing, a lot of discussion of view, because many of the practices that I invite people to take on at this point are counter-instinctual. We don't want to do them. They involve staying embodied with exactly those feelings that we've spent our life trying to not feel. So I talk with people a fair amount about why it might be to their own selfish benefit to take responsibility for working with their difficult experience. One of the reframes I often use is to point out that whenever we claim that our partner is responsible for our pain, our frustration, our hurt, whatever, we're actually positioning ourselves as a powerless, usually resentful victim. We're saying, you're responsible for my state of mind. Of course, that means that we have to try to change our partner to have a better state of mind. But we can't change our partner. So we're not really taking very good care of ourselves at that point. If we're ready to take better care of ourselves, then it may involve the difficult discipline of understanding that almost all of our disturbance about our partner turns out to be our unwillingness to have a conscious, kind, embodied relationship with the disturbing feelings that our partner triggers in us. It's not actually that our partner is disturbing us. More precisely, it's that our partner is triggering deep core issues within us that we still are refusing to have a direct relationship with. Once somebody starts to consider the view that their actual issue is with themselves, not with their partner, then they may be more willing to just leave their partner out of their disturbance. When somebody is willing to investigate their difficult core vulnerabilities, almost always they're going to find that they've been living with these feelings all their life. They had these difficult feelings before they met their partner. If they ended the relationship tomorrow, they'd still have these feelings. One's partner is not the cause of one's disturbance, and so will never be the solution to one's disturbance. So basically, it's wasted effort to address one's disturbance in terms of one's partner. This doesn't, of course, mean that we stop negotiating about behaviors. We just drop our fascination with the idea that our partners are responsible for our feelings. They definitely will trigger these feelings, but they are not the cause of these feelings. So there's an increased capacity at this stage to discriminate between personal work and interpersonal work. And at this stage, the interpersonal work often has to do with solving apparent problems. Our personal work has to do with investigating why is it that I'm claiming that certain feelings are a big deal, even as if my survival is being threatened. And this is the stage at which the practices of embodied immediacy are especially valuable. When we're willing to stay at the sensation level of our experience, no interpretations, we find out for ourselves, so it's not my opinion or something they read in a book, but we find out for ourselves where's the evidence that feeling abandoned, feeling smothered, feeling controlled, feeling hurt in some way is actually harmful. If we jump into our interpretations, of course there will always be evidence about why this is a really bad thing that must be avoided. But when we're willing to stay present in our immediate embodied experience, in my opinion, we never are going to find any evidence about our worth as a person. We're not even going to find abandonment or smothering or anything like that, because those aren't sensations. They're already strongly interpretive experiences. So if somebody really wants to start to step out of their conditioned history, the practice of embodied immediacy is a very powerful practice and can be introduced at this stage of work. Another practice that I often invite people to consider is to discriminate between feelings and behavior, because many people feel that if they feel a certain way, somehow they're supposed to behave that way, at least in the realm of intimacy. But if somebody really examines their life, they're not going to find much evidence that that's the way to be functional out in the world. If we want a job, we get up in the morning even if we'd rather stay in bed, even if we don't feel like going. If we don't want to go to jail or something, we pay our taxes, even if we don't want to. If we want a committed long-term relationship, we're probably not sexual with whoever we feel attracted to. We don't just punch anybody we're angry at. If we want to get good at a skill, a craft, at music, we have to discipline ourselves to hang in there even when we feel frustrated. So if we really start looking at what allows us to be competent and skillful in the world, we find we have to have the capacity to behave in ways that we have thought about rather than behave in ways that are run by our feelings. But for many of us, the realm of intimacy is almost like its own private dissociative realm. It's like being a young child in our families of origin again. And we behave in ways that are very driven by emotions. We treat our partners in ways that we wouldn't actually even treat our friends. So at this stage, the stage of the personal, we're willing to begin experimenting with an attitude of discipline. That discipline is actually necessary for healthy intimacy. But for many of us, this is an alien idea. We think of intimacy as just this realm of spontaneity and acting based on our feelings, and we think there's something a little strange about bringing an attitude of discipline to relating to one's partner. But when somebody's willing to take personal responsibility for dealing with very difficult experience, and they find that that work is counter-instinctual, we have to be willing to experiment with the attitude of discipline. As we continue taking better care of ourselves, at some stage I introduce the language of effective selfishness. I usually don't start with that because our culture has a lot of negative connotations about selfish. Sometimes a discussion about effective selfishness is confusing for people, especially those exposed to Buddhist practice or views, where there is said to be no self. So what I'm addressing at this point is the actual experience that almost all of us have at this stage of things, that there still does appear to be a very solid, significant self. We might have been exposed to the theory that there's no self, but the actual experience most of us live with is there seems to be a very real self that we want to protect and improve. So at this stage of work, we're working with the appearance of self and not yet really addressing the idea of no self. And as long as we do have this experience of self, doesn't it make sense to do a good job of being this self? The real question is how to be effectively selfish. And most of us in relationships are actually being quite ineffectively selfish, meaning that we're still trying to take care of ourselves with our adult partners as if we're a child in our families of origin. It's several decades out of date. It's not wrong, it's just not working very well. So at this stage, I start to talk with people about how can you take such good care of yourself that you stop accumulating any complaint about your partner? How can you have no resentment, no blame? Or, in more positive language, how can you actually keep your heart open to your partner even when things are difficult? Well, one approach to that very difficult question is to consider that if we are taking really good care of ourselves, we probably will not have complaints because we're taking such good care of ourselves. So at this point, I often suggest a practice that if either person has any complaint about their partner, about anything, instead of unconsciously looking at their partner and what they have or have not done, instead we experiment with the view that if I have a complaint about my partner, that's actually a signal that I have not taken adequate care of myself. And that's my responsibility. Obviously, my partner's not here on the planet to take care of me. The evidence should be pretty clear by now. So rather than perpetuating this drama of complaint and deficit and problem and disappointment, am I ready to take such good care of myself that my heart is actually open? I don't wait for my partner anymore for me to have a satisfying life. So this sense of effective selfishness really has to do with orienting ourselves to the connection between being a separate person who is willing to treat themselves so well, to have effective boundaries, assert needs, have conflict when necessary, strangely enough, so that we can keep our heart open to our partner. Because in my experience, when we do not take good care of ourselves in relationship, almost always we retract into a state of self-absorption. We try to take care of ourselves in some compensatory way at that point. Maybe we rehearse what we should have said. Maybe we go off and exercise or meditate instead of relating to our partner, whatever. But the more confidence we have that we will take good care of ourselves in relationship, then again, paradoxically, it's safer to be very, very intimate with one's partner. We start to challenge our previous unconscious assumptions that too much closeness with one's partner is actually going to work to our disadvantage. So being close and the more fundamental experience of intimacy, of alternating between feeling close and feeling separate, starts to lose its problematic sense because we are committed to taking such good care of ourselves, to be effectively selfish. In this discussion, of course, it's very important to point out that for most of us, being effectively selfish has to include our relational needs too, because in our culture, often selfishness is seen as some type of withdrawal from relationship, some isolation. So obviously that's not true. To take really good care of oneself means, of course, to also take really good care of one's relationship needs. As a couple moves in this direction, of course, it's usually with a lot of forward and backward movement. And I personally see the backward movement not as a problem, but as a type of unconscious reassurance. that the couple is reassuring themselves that they don't have to step into too much vulnerability yet, too much openness, that they can always go back and have a fight and feel pissed off at each other and so forth. But generally speaking, as a couple moves in the direction of dissolving complaints, blame, and so forth, with hopefully both people taking such good care of themselves that basically they experience keeping their heart open, even when things are difficult, then their experience starts to enter that next stage of the interpersonal. And at this point, it's possible to practice kindness. And it has to actually be a practice because often we're not going to feel that way. But the practice is unconditional kindness in our behavior and even more difficultly in our thinking toward everything we experience without exception. And that means we, at this stage of our path, are willing to treat our partners kindly regardless of how we feel. And we do this for practical reasons, not out of some should or out of some type of morality, which doesn't last very long usually or go very deep. But we've really become experientially clear that it is to our benefit to treat others kindly, just like it's to our benefit to treat ourselves kindly. But to do this, we really have to have cultivated the capacity to discriminate between feelings and behavior, to not be too fascinated with our complaints, and to find out for ourselves, is it true that when I treat my partner kindly, it works out better than when I have a conflict with them and blame them for my difficult feelings? Of course, it sounds a little silly to say that, but this is actually quite a difficult practice. But if we consider it, doesn't it seem likely that if we treat our partner kindly, it's much more likely they'll treat us kindly? It's not a guarantee, but it's just more likely. And if I am choosing to be in this relationship, then why wouldn't I want to have a relationship that basically is one in which we treat each other well and kindly? And this is a major sort of shift even from the personal into the interpersonal stage, where we begin to experience our being in relationship as choice. We've pretty much dissolved our fantasy of being trapped by the kids or a mortgage or because we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings or we're afraid of being alone or whatever. Obviously, we're not trapped in any relationship. We always have the option to leave. We might have to deal with very difficult consequences, but we're not trapped. But it's not until this stage of our work that we actually start to live with that experience. Every day, I am in this relationship by choice. And because I'm clear that this is my choice, my partner doesn't owe me anything. And it's just common sense to treat them well at that point, because I will have a better experience of being in this relationship. So at this point, we actually become curious about the practice of being generous to one's partner and patient with their various limitations and so on. At first, it may make sense to call our generosity to our partner's attention, get credit for it. That's part of being effectively selfish, actually. But at a certain point, we even drop that sort of keeping score and wanting acknowledgement or credit and just experiment with being kind, generous, patient for our partners in so many ways that are possible every day, giving up any fantasy of recognition. And we do this at this point because it actually is to our benefit. It gives rise to a better state of mind. I don't, of course, work with many couples who are at this stage, maybe who are entering this stage, but when a couple is actually experiencing this degree of kindness, they usually don't want to continue spending their valuable money and time in therapy when they could do a lot of more interesting things with it. But if, for some reason, a person's personal work continues to have a certain momentum, then they might enter the stage of the non-personal. At this point, we pretty much have dropped any project of self-improvement or greater intimacy because we don't live with a sense of problem at this point. Our experience is pretty much arising in the environment of open awareness, freedom, as our sort of home base that we keep spontaneously and organically returning to. We find that it's just inherently satisfying to be alive. And it's interesting to be in an intimate relationship. It's interesting actually to be provoked. It gives us some interesting things to work with, to look at. We've pretty much dissolved the fantasy of being a problematic person at this point, and therefore needing a problematic relationship. It doesn't mean that our relationship is suddenly passionate and fun all the time and without problems. Of course, we still have our human life to live. We still have bills to pay. We might have health problems. Our partner still might trigger disturbing feelings. It's just not a problem anymore. It's actually interesting. At this point, we can look back and be very appreciative of our codependency, our struggles with personal responsibilities, our difficulty in being kind, because we see at that point all of that was exactly what we needed to work on to free ourselves of our fascination with our chronic self-absorption and identity dramas. So we don't even have an idea then that we've wasted any time. My partner has helped me force out into the open exactly what I have had to work on. I haven't enjoyed it maybe, but it's been incredibly generous of them to help me, because I probably wouldn't have brought these issues out into the open just on my own. So I hope that this discussion has suggested a certain sense of path in relationships, that there's a reason to do certain practices, that there's a direction we might want to move in. It's all an experiment, no guarantees, but personally, it seems to me that in our culture, an intimate relationship is about the most powerful vehicle most of us have for waking up. Our culture really doesn't have many viable, effective spiritual disciplines. But intimacy is going to give us exactly what it is that we need to work on to relax our refusal to be fully present, to relax into expansive awareness and open-heartedness. So I'm very grateful for my relationship, and I love working with couples. So I'd like to make a few closing comments now about the larger theme that we've been discussing through all of these sessions. I thought it might be helpful to close with a comment on the title of the program, Already Free, Buddhism Meets Psychotherapy on the Path of Liberation. Already free is the view that upon investigation, we will discover that what is most fundamentally true is that our basic nature is that of freedom. It doesn't mean that our more relative experiences of being this limited body, living our life full of limitations, is not true, just that it's more true that as we go deeper and deeper into our experience, we will not find anything deeper or more fundamental than, more intimate than the experience of unconditional, already existing freedom. This, of course, is called many things in different traditions, open awareness, basic nature, whatever, but no name captures this open state. Buddhism meets psychotherapy. Very simplistically, Buddhism could be understood as a way of working based on immediacy. We investigate the truth of our experience right now, in this present moment, and ask, is there any evidence of something missing, some problem, something to heal or fix? And we explore this question within our immediate embodied experience, staying out of any interpretations whatsoever. This is a generic practice. We return to embodied immediacy, open awareness, open-heartedness, over and over and over and over, regardless of the issue that we're working with. And we discover that we can be present without resolving any of our issues. Psychotherapy can be understood as a way of working based on an appreciation of how our conditioned history invites us to relate to our immediate experience in familiar habitual ways. That, while comfortable, in a certain sense, are actually decades out of date by now. By working within our stories, within our interpretations, we gradually learn to tell ourselves a better story about our life, to behave more skillfully, and to gradually tolerate more and more openness in our ongoing experiencing. This is an issue-specific practice where we focus on a particular disturbance until some adequate improvement arises. We discover that working within our habitual patterns gradually translates into an experience of being more present and less reactive, even when we're no longer in therapy. In this approach, no integrated view is being presented, no resolution in this dialogue between Buddhism and psychotherapy. And this is my intention in my clinical work, in my life, and in these discussions, to invite a direct experience of nothing to really hang on to, tolerating contradictory energies without a fantasy of resolution. What is the actual experience of not two, not one? Path. The understanding of path presented here has been that of Vajrayana Buddhism. That while from the most fundamental experience of already existing freedom, no path is necessary, from a practical point of view, most of us do not consciously participate in this basic nature. And if we want to increase this conscious participation, we need to walk this path and do our personal work. So our path can be understood as a gradually increasing ability to consciously participate in what's already true. Liberation, this can be a sudden but usually is a gradual experience that we are in fact already free. Actually, it's more than we are free. It's the experience that we are most basically the experience of freedom. This isn't a change in what's true, it's a change in how we relate to what's true, how we experience what's true. And most people experiencing this shift in consciousness describe the experience as one of deep freedom, open-heartedness, confidence, clarity, vulnerability. I thought I'd like to close with a classic Buddhist metaphor that many of you have probably heard about the sun and the clouds. Imagine that we live where it's always cloudy. We never see the sun. And we just take our everyday experience, of course, as if it's reality. It's perhaps a little claustrophobic in some vague way, but it's comfortable and familiar. Then perhaps we meet somebody who says that's not the whole story, there's something else. So we go with them, they guide us up a mountain, and we climb through the cloud cover. And there's this incredibly intense experience of sun and expansive sky. It completely changes our sense of what's available to us. We return to our daily life, but we'll never really be the same. It's possible that we might unconsciously just allow this to become a memory, something very valuable that we experienced. Another possibility, though, is that we use this memory to remind ourselves in the present moment that that sun is still there, even though we don't have a conscious experience of it. We might find that that one experience was enough to develop a certain confidence, or we may find that it's helpful to climb that mountain many times to develop this confidence. But we may find that increasingly we live as if the sun is always there. We live with a sense of expansiveness. We don't take our daily life as if it's the whole story. We don't feel oppressed by the experience of limitation anymore. We start to realize, in fact, that the sun and the clouds, our daily life, are all one piece, that the clouds are just as valid as the sun. And we start actually giving up a fantasy of achievement. If only I could live in the sun. Well, we have that choice. We can go live on top of the mountains if we want, or we can live in our daily life. But it's all one piece. Awareness actually is not separate from our relative experiencing. As we dissolve this fantasy that the sun is somehow some different realm than our daily life, We might even dissolve the sense that we are separate from our own experiencing. As we realize that we're there, we're the ones who are actually having this drama. We may even investigate deeper and find what is most common in all of our experience of the sun, our experience of the clouds in daily life, our experience of ourself even. And what we may find is that what's always there is awareness. We may then be willing to relax into the actual experience of being awareness as our basic nature, being freedom as our basic nature. This actually dissolves the fantasy of being a separate self. As we end this program, I'm thinking of how we began, which was with my sharing something of my interest in therapy, how I found it very difficult to continue in the typical Western view, my connection with Buddhism and my teacher Trungpa Rinpoche, and finding a way to return to therapy, informed by a Buddhist understanding. It's been almost 40 years of study and practice, more than 30 years of clinical work as a therapist, and I feel so grateful to my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche. There were so many gifts from being his student, listening to his teachings, being in his presence. And I think one of the greatest gifts was experiencing his energy of outrageous confidence. He was completely engaged with being human. There was nothing that I ever witnessed that he was not willing to experience and work with. This is one of the reasons that Vajrayana Buddhism is sometimes called the fast path, that nothing is discarded, everything is used, however disturbing, however joyful. And if there were one of these gifts that I might try to pass on to you, it would be this encouragement to discard nothing, appreciate everything. Look for wakefulness, look for compassion, look for freedom in every moment of your experience, whether it's anger, hunger, depression, joy. If you look for what's already there, you will find it. And I feel confident in saying it is already there.